Welcome to the Regulatory Roadmap webinar series, where we are this afternoon going to speak about post-market surveillance, another one of those really important cornerstones of regulation, both in Europe, UK, and in fact around the world. And I'm really pleased to invite two speakers to the conversation today. Firstly, Camilla Fleetcroft, and secondly, Duncan Porter. Camilla originally qualified as a doctor and looking to build her career in public health. She took up the position of clinical advisor in MHRA in 2013, and since then has spent a short time also with conformity assessment body, SGS, particularly as a regulatory and clinical affairs manager. She rejoined MHRA to head up the clinical investigation and evaluation team for medical devices. And in fact, in 2020, she took on the role of device regulatory group manager alongside the work to support the response to the pandemic. And she led the team responsible for reviewing and developing the consultation on the new CA marking process. At the end of May, she left MHRA to start a new career as a consultant with Eclevar. So it's really good to invite Camilla along to our call this afternoon. Duncan is the general manager of the global sample and collection and transport business of Thermo Fisher Scientific, who he joined in 2018. In fact, in 2018, he joined Thermo Fisher as the Senior Marketing Director, leading clinical microbiology and a global portfolio of innovation, including culture media, antibiotic susceptibility testing, and most recently at the forefront of critical global pandemic programs, including viral sample collection and serology antibody testing. Before Thermo Fisher, Duncan worked in a number of global companies, including Fuji and Philips, where he sort of was looking at global processes for business, including joint ventures both in China and around the world. So it's really good to invite Duncan to our call this afternoon as well. So welcome to you both. Thanks again for joining us, Cam and Duncan, for our discussion this afternoon. We're going to kick off talking about post-market surveillance, which is one of those really interesting topics. I think that when I first started doing regulatory work, post-market surveillance was really just confined to, oh, I have to fill in a vigilance form, don't I? Or, how quickly do I have to get back to the MHRA on this? But post-market surveillance has developed so much over the last few years, particularly. So it's really good to sort of try and describe that. So, Camilla, first of all, let's come to you. What does a good post-market surveillance program look like? How is it really sort of seen in the regulation?
So I think first off, it's really important that you've got to bear in mind it's a proactive function. It is the commitment beyond your UKCA mark or your CE mark, and it is that proactive collection of data and analysis that really allows for that timely identification of relevant data, maybe new risks that you weren't expecting, but really keeps that picture of your device growing and that knowledge for your own device growing. So it really allows you as a company to review and make those appropriate updates or improvements as necessary. It also gives you that ability to spot and trend incidents that may be occurring, problems that might be developing. And really, it does really allow that company to continue to ensure they're meeting those regulatory requirements for their device throughout its life cycle. So, for example, things that could be impacted on by a PMCF are your design and development, risk management aspects for your device, clinical and performance evaluation obviously have a natural impact from your PMCF system. And like I already said, product improvement and changes. And the one that most people will associate it with, of course, is marketing data and sales data. Looping all of that together in a really defined, clear system really gives you that really valuable knowledge and data that was a little bit more haphazard previously under the directives, but under the regulation is a much clearer process.
So it's a really holistic view, if you like, as to what your product is like on the market. So Duncan, that must be really tough as a company to try and figure out what to do with PMS, how it actually is, how you collect that data, how you actually put that into your company process.
Phil, absolutely, and I think the summary there of Cam was beautifully articulated, but it also feeds into a lot of values of companies around continued performance improvement. And it's not about having a regulatory framework that simply provides conformity and safety of a product. It's also linking towards how that product is used and the performance of that product over time. And if we look at things like microbiology, where drugs and bugs are changing over time, that you want to make sure that the efficacy and the performance of that product is really matching the way in which the customers are utilizing that product as well. So actually it fits into our mantra, it fits into our quality system, but also our DNA of continuous improvement of product as well. So it actually really brings things together rather than divergent. It's cohesion within the business.
So whereabouts do you find that data though, Duncan? Is that something that you get the whole of Thermo Fisher involved with, or do you specify or target certain areas?
Yeah, it's a great question, Phil. And we've all been on this regulatory chain. It's been a journey for a number of years, and having to assess what that means for our organization, the number of SKUs that are involved that are linked to it. Historically, regulatory conformance have sort of sat within the sort of regulatory and quality teams. They've been responsible for technical files and all of the elements that come through for those submissions. But as we've moved into IVDR and post-market surveillance, that becomes the responsibility of multiple stakeholders and much more of the ethos of the organization. So the product managers, as part of marketing, their responsibility to continually scan the market, understand what competitive moves are happening, how that product is performing within the market, what customers are using that product for. Our technical service side of things, any complaints that come in from customers or queries on how that product is performing, all of those points of data then come together to support that post-market surveillance package that is a part of our quality system.
And Camilla, I remember at one time when I was doing a lot of quality management work, we used to say, well, everybody's responsible for quality in the company. And I suppose in many ways, that's the same now with post-market surveillance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think whilst it's a regulatory shift, obviously, in its basis, it's a cultural shift. It's about that ownership across the team. And like I said, from development and design right through to your complaints department, it's about joining all that up together and making sure you've got the right data coming through. So I think you're absolutely right. It's everyone's responsibility now. But equally on the flip side, I'll put my little clinician hat back on. It's also the responsibility of the system that those devices feed into to make sure that you are feeding back your experience of those devices you use, any issues you have, and being more mindful of that role that we play as consumers in that post-market surveillance. Not one necessarily people immediately think of, but that is the flip side of all this.
And you mentioned right at the beginning, Camilla, about how you're using PMS to assess risk. So presumably then you have to sort of have that link with the processes that you have for post-market surveillance with how you then assess everything to do with risk.
Absolutely. And, it's important that you bear that in mind and that it is intrinsically part of your risk management system as well, and that they feed together backwards and forwards, and that it is that joined up. There's not a risk team over here doing their thing and a post-market surveillance. It really is about joining the dots. And I think that's one of the big success stories of the regulation is that approach, that more holistic approach, like you wisely said at the beginning, to joining up those various functions, quality management, risk management, all vital parts of this post-market surveillance system.
So just as a little bit of an insight, Duncan, how does Thermo Fisher manage that? Do you have a post-market surveillance team, or is post-market surveillance sort of handled by the regulatory exclusively?
No, the responsibility with regards to coordinating it, sort of the conductor within the orchestra, is the quality team, but they are linked directly into those multiple stakeholders that we've discussed before, whether that's into marketing, whether that's into technical support, whether that's into manufacturing, etc. All of those things come together. It's also multinational, so it's not only happening in one particular geography. It's not isolated that you say, okay, post-market surveillance only happens here in the UK. This is a global affair, and we are therefore monitoring activities that are happening in the global markets, whether there are changes in certain geographies that may be affecting the performance or usage of that product or device. And then that feeds back into that post-market surveillance process itself.
Can these sorts of processes be used for activities other than just that sort of review of how your product's performing? I'm thinking of whether or not you use PMS as a route for product lifecycle or for product development. Are those sorts of things which are also integrated into the work that you do, Duncan?
Absolutely. As I alluded to earlier, we're at a start of a journey with regards to post-market surveillance. There has, of course, been historically more of a reactive than a proactive approach. This now enables us to utilize that data points as part of that data file to help support both any reformulation of product that may need to be adapted with the changing environments that it's working in, or product improvement as well. So it shouldn't be seen as a burden on an organization. It should actually be embraced and seen as a vehicle in order to drive that continuous improvement that I alluded to earlier.
So it's almost like a consolidation of what good practice should be, really, and sort of what we should all be doing as manufacturers anyway.
Absolutely. I think it brings the quality and regulatory organization to really the core of the business as well, that they, rather than being a supporting function, are actually an enabling function of the business. And that is a fundamental shift. I'm excited about it. I think it is the right approach. It helps organizations, whether you're a large multinational company like Thermo Fisher, or you're a small SME that thinks that these regulatory hurdles are big challenges to get over. It's the same for all organizations. Those regulatory guidelines or frameworks are there to ensure that the products and services that we provide are safe and that they deliver to the claims and capabilities that we define to them. However, some of these products have been on the market for many years, and therefore it's important to utilize post-market surveillance to ensure that those products continue to deliver on their intended use and the performance criteria that are set against them.
That's a really good comment, Duncan. And Camilla, maybe I could ask you as a follow-up from Duncan's comment there. Does PMS change, or the degree of PMS change with maturity of the product, or do you maintain the same sort of level of maintenance as you go through?
I think there's probably an idealistic answer and a realistic answer to this. The commitment is obviously that you do have to have your post-market system in place, regardless of the product you're dealing with. I think what's important to note is that the steps probably don't change greatly. Duncan may have more practical insight, but the steps that the regulations expect you to follow don't change. That is very clear. But what you do within that, the data collection, the analysis you do, I think probably does change throughout the life cycle of the device. And naturally, as you get a more well-defined, experienced device, I think you will get that different feedback and you will see that different data come through. But I don't think the process itself really fundamentally changes. What is set out in the regulation is very clear, gold standard, if you will, approach to how you collect and analyze that data, the submissions you have to put through for your device, whatever classification it may be. And I think that's just good practice. I wouldn't expect that principle and process to change, but I would certainly expect the outputs and the sort of generation of data to change slightly as that device becomes more established in its use.
And that must be sort of written into some of your processes, Duncan, on risk, I guess. You sort of look at, well, this product's been on the market for 10 years now, and, maybe some of the elements that you use as part of your process change in their importance. So I'm guessing, sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but, I'm guessing that things like vigilance reporting and the amount of vigilance that you get might become more important for your more mature products than maybe some of the early ones, or maybe it's the other way around, I don't know.
So the way in which we interpret this is very much linked to the IVDR classification of products, and that's very much linked to patient risk and the elements that are associated with that product or device. So that frequency and the depth of post-market surveillance and the post-market surveillance plan then varies versus that's an A, B, C, or D product classification of that. A periodic safety review has to happen every 12 months anyway, so that's part of that annual cycle and review place that comes through. And then, of course, we're required to provide regular updates to our notified body on the safety and effectiveness of those products as well. With regards to the go live of the IVDR regulations, then we have now 2 years for Class A devices and products to have that PMS data report ready, and then 12 months for the C and D classes, again coming back to the perceived patient risk and classification of those products and devices within the portfolio.
Brilliant. Camilla, I know that in your past you used to work for a notified body or a conformity assessment body.
Digging back far now.
Has the requirement on conformity assessment bodies changed as far as reviewing that as in the clinical? In the quality management system reviews, what sort of things are the conformity assessment bodies looking for? There's lots of people on the line, I think, who may not even have worked with conformity assessment bodies before. So I think it's a useful sort of insight, perhaps, as to what sort of things are you going to be scrutinised over?
So, fundamentally, an approved body or a notified body is just looking to evaluate your data, your technical files, your dossiers, to ensure that you have adequately demonstrated the safety and performance of the product that you have put on their desk. Now, that, as you quite wisely says, Phil, has changed over the last few years of the regulations, and increased notified body scrutiny is one of the key drivers behind the new regulations. Now, with regard to post-market surveillance, that also includes that's part of that life cycle approach. And first of all, what they're looking for, again, is that continued data and analysis that the product continues to meet its regulatory requirements, it continues to be compliant, and most critically continues to be safe to be on the market. Now, it's done in varying degrees through classification, and just sort of conscious of time and going through too much regulatory jargon, but they are required to review the data. Now, they are required to review the data for all classification, but what's particularly interesting is for your Class 3s and your Class Ds, they're required to submit their evaluation of that data that you have given them in the report that Duncan mentioned, the PSURs. They will be required to make that available to competent authorities in the future. I will add in the future via UDMED in the future. And so you continue to see this shift of scrutiny and responsibility. So it's no longer a case of a company will do their PMS, they may do a very good job, but ultimately it goes in a drawer in a folder and is just their knowledge. What you're doing now is that transparency. You're saying, this is our post-market system, this is our post-market data we've generated over this year or the 2 years previously, depending on your class of device. And aren't we doing a good job? This is it. We're demonstrating our conformity. Nothing's being hidden. It's about that trust and transparency in the system. And I personally welcome it. I appreciate it adds burden and challenge, but I think it's got real merit to have that checkpoint put in place in the regulation. I think it provides us with a bit more consistency and certainly a bit more of a onus to do the job properly and to submit it properly.
And maybe a difficult follow-up question. If that's what the conformity assessment bodies are looking for, how does that butt up against what the competent authority are looking for? Are the competent authority active in looking at post-market surveillance data other than vigilance reporting, or is it just vigilance reporting?
So I don't think there's any clear answer to that. I think it will very much depend on the competent authority. There is oversight, more oversight than they've had before. From the point of view of what they're looking for, I speak from my experiences that it would be very much the same. You're looking at that safety and performance data, you're looking at any trends of incidents that might have come through that conclusion, particularly if PSURs, so those higher risk devices, and just adding to that level of scrutiny, adding to that level of transparency of the devices on the markets. So I don't think what they're looking for changes greatly. I think the level of input from a competent authority will vary greatly from competent authority. As we know, historically across the EU, we often get different approaches. And I think that will remain. But I think what's really important is that the data is there. The data is there for all classification of device, like medical devices or IVDs, and it should be there on request. So if a competent authority goes to even a class 1 manufacturer or a class A and says, excuse me, I'd like to see your PMS data for the last year, that should be on the competent authority's desk within 1 to 2 working days, I would think, is probably what they'll be asked for. And I think that's a real achievement in the regulation. If I can be as a bold ex-competent authority worker, I think having that access is really important, and it gives the competent authority visibility they haven't had in the past. And so we've seen cases and issues over the years where competent authorities have to ask for data, and it can be quite clunky, not readily available. But now there is that onus that this is a yearly, 2-yearly process, or as you need to, and it's there, it's done. And so if I knock on your door or anyone else knocks on your door, you can hand it over and we can look at it in whatever detail we like. And that's the commitment, and I think that's I completely appreciate, and Duncan will definitely have an opinion of this. It's definitely a burden. It's definitely another challenge, but I think it's one of the ones in the regulation that actually adds value to the market that is receiving those devices.
We've talked up until now very much about the sort of the proactive side of post-market surveillance, I guess, and that's been dictated, of course, largely by regulatory change, but more sort of now that sort of understanding of how your product's working. So it would be remiss of us not in the last 5 minutes or so to maybe talk about the reactive side of PMS, which is vigilance reporting. And Duncan, I'm really reluctant to say you must have, because you're a big global manufacturer, you must have a massive vigilance department looking at these sorts of things. But it's really important, isn't it, to sort of collect that real-time data to sort of address those issues that come up immediately with customers, whether they're complaints or adverse events.
Absolutely, and those vehicles, those processes have obviously been in place for many years. CAPA reviews any customer complaints or elements where product has not performed as they expected it to from those situations. The move towards post-market surveillance and the standards around IVDR just link into that as well. So those haven't fundamentally changed from the elements that we were doing from a reactive stage historically. They're just now being blended together with the proactive approach of post-market surveillance as well. I can't emphasize the level of effort that it has been to bring the organization forward in that, and that has been a big investment in order to do that. But like Camilla, I believe that this is the right thing to do. It's in the best interest of continued improvement, which is core to our ethos as an organization. But it's also ultimately in the benefit of the patient, because they're ensuring that they're getting the most up-to-date, the best product or device to serve their need, their condition, their diagnosis at that particular point in time as well. So yes, it's been a fundamental evolutionary journey and a change that we've been on, but it's certainly in the right direction, and it will enable us to continue to make sure that we've got world-class products that do the right things into the right markets.
And Camilla, I would like to think that reactive vigilance reporting is not something that manufacturers should be shying away from. In fact, you're always going to end up with complaints or adverse events. You can never completely design risk out of products. But is it fair to say that you can use vigilance in a positive way as well as in a patient safety way?
Absolutely. I think vigilance, I think it's funny, isn't it? We use the term reactive as almost it was a bad thing, but actually it's a still really valuable input into the post-market data. And I think it's hugely valuable. It's true real world data. It's true use of that device. And so I think if you are getting complaints, you are getting incidents reports, absolutely don't shy away from them. They hold information for you as well. So they tell you, was this a one-off, or, trend reporting has obviously become part and parcel of the regulation. Is there a trend forming? How do you decide whether that is significant? And I think that's really important data to feed in. And we've touched on it a few times. It's how you develop and improve your device or your IVD. It's how you learn about what improvements need to be made to make your device either stay in compliance or just become better. And I think it's really, really important. So absolutely don't shy away from it. Embrace it. It's almost free information. You don't have to put any work into it. It comes to you through the system. And analyze it as you would any other data, loop it into your post-market surveillance, and it helps build that true picture of the use of your device.
And I know that, Camilla, you helped us out with the webinar on clinical investigations and that sort of stuff, but vigilance obviously has an overlap in the clinical investigation side too, right?
Yeah, of course. With that, it's a reactive, but again, it's really informative of going through all the incidents that come through any trial that you're conducting on your device. So absolutely. I think that's a really good question, because it just points to the fact that this is such a cyclical process. So you're doing it from the beginning. You just keep doing it, whatever stage you are in your product life cycle. And I mean, we don't have time to go into it in detail, but of course, we haven't spoken even about PMCF studies as part of this process. Again, you're running through that research process. Incidents will happen. Use them, learn from them, and build them into your data.
So one last question to both of you. We were talking, I think, in one of the other webinars as well, about when you start, for example, a risk management process, and at what point do you start gathering information like that. A lot of the companies that we've got watching these webinars may be at a point where they have yet to market a product or even have a product ready. But at what point do you think those SMEs, those smaller companies should start thinking about post-market surveillance? Is it something which should be ingrained in a regulatory strategy right from the get-go, or is it something that you should plan for as you get to that point where you're marketing a product? Probably a difficult question. Maybe it's different for each company. I don't know. What do you think, Duncan?
Phil, no, it's a great question. And I also link in my mind back to sort of legacy portfolios where you've had product that may have been on the market for 10, 15, 20 years already, that you say, okay, we've seen this regulatory change. When do we start this post-market surveillance activity? The simple answer is you should have already started. It happens immediately. We have been going through some of the topics that we've discussed with regards to instant reporting and these things already. This is an extension of that, but to become more proactive in the approach. And then, of course, in the development of new products, then part of that activity pre-defining or developing those products should be to understand the market landscape, what's going on, what competitive products are out there today, what our customers' unmet needs or actual usage of product today in their working practices. So those elements will start to form that post-market surveillance data file that will then evolve over time and become richer and more mature as that product has been in the market through its life cycle.
Brilliant. Last word, Cam?
I was just going to add to that, I completely agree. It should have started at the beginning, but it's also to remember it's not static. Whatever you put in place at the beginning isn't what you have to follow. As you learn with your device, your plan can change. You may find that you have a bit of a data gap you want to plug, use a study. It is flexible. It's to meet your needs. But absolutely agree with Duncan. It should be one of the first things you put in place.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much for your time. It was a really, really interesting discussion, and it was great to sort of pitch a view from a conformity assessment body and the competent authority against what happens actually in industry. So it was a brilliant discussion. So thank you again very much for your time, and hope you found the webinar informative.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.